until we do something about the atmosphere, we're not going to see any change in the city itself. So what we're going to do is kind of draw some of this on the whiteboard and talk about the atmosphere and how we can change it and kind of where we are. Okay, I'm going to put this over here so you can see. All right. So we don't have a lot of time. Perfect, thank you. We don't have a lot of time for a full teaching, so I'm not going to go into all the scriptures. I know you all know the word. So I'm just going to summarize some things, okay? You can fill in the blanks. I know it's a drawing, but it will be helpful, I promise. So God has created the heavens and the earth, right? God rules and reigns. He is seated in heavens, and the earth has become his footstool. So he is the Lord of all of it. I'm not going to go into it, but when Adam and Eve sinned, they got separated from both the presence of the Lord, and they also got kicked out of their land. So right now, even though he occupies heaven, the earth, for the most part, has been given over to the enemy because of the abdication of humans. But it's important to note, that we talked about it a moment ago, he never gave the devil authority over the earth.
Right.
The enemy only got it because Adam and Eve abdicated, right? Which is still true about us today. So we're just so we've got heaven here, we've got the earth here, and for the earth, for our purposes today, this is Wyandotte County. Okay. In the middle of the story are some believers. Okay, and we're going to make this the church. So we've got some. So this is a church. So we have churches in Wyandotte County. I don't know. Anybody know how many? Too many.
Over 400.
400. Really?
Yes.
Okay, so it's kind of shocking, isn't it? So we have churches all over Wyandotte County. 400. So just a reference back to Haggai, one of the reasons we don't have transformation is we're all dwelling in our own paneled houses, and the house of the Lord is lying in ruins.
Yes.
You know, we sow, but we don't reap. We earn wages to put in a bag with holes in it. We clothe ourselves, but we're not warm. We eat, but we're not filled, which I was actually going to talk about last night. So it's not necessarily a good thing that we have 400 churches if we don't have a representation of the corporate identity of the body of Christ, which is what we're missing, which is what this process is about. So here's the community, here's the context that we're in. So everybody's doing their own thing. I mean, sometimes there's things probably happening together, but for the most part, we have churches all over the city, and they're all busy doing all kinds of things, okay? So now what we're going to look at, I want to, one of the things that the Fijians say, which I think is good, is if you want to see transformation, you have to become a good fruit inspector.
Yes.
So we're going to inspect the fruit of Wyandotte County. Not for too long, or we'll get depressed, but I want you to tell me. Fruit is something you see visibly above the ground. Okay, so I want you to think about the things you know going on in the county, things you're reading about in the newspaper, or just things that you see in your daily life or in your neighborhood. What is some of the fruit that you see growing up in the land of Wyandotte County?
Addictions.
Trafficking?
Prostitution.
Prostitution.
Drug addictions.
Addictions, yeah.
Prostitution. Hold on. Addictions. What was the other one? Families, broken families.
Yeah.
Poverty.
A massive increase of the mental health community
Yes,
Mental illness.
Yes,
and demon possession. Yes.
Just a sec. Demonic activity. Oh, was the other one? Compromise of what?
Compromising the word.
That's not a fruit. You've got fruit is something you can see. So that would be a root. We'll get to that in a moment.
Poverty.
Fruit is what you see, huh?
Poverty.
We have poverty. Yep.
I don't know how to really word this where it seems like monopoly of the government.
Like corruption.
Corruption.
There's a lot of corruption.
A lot.
Yes, sir.
Justice. Those are different. Okay, we've got broken families.
Violence.
Violence, yeah.
Murder.
Hold on, yeah, violence.
Ain't got no more lane.
Well, I know. Violence and bloodshed. How about, I'm gonna separate abortion, although that's bloodshed. We'll put immorality.
Yeah.
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 Perhaps homosexuality.
Oh, yeah.
Immorality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What?
All together.
Well, you can't see that. How would that manifest? It's a root. What?
Social injustice.
Yep, we have injustice. We have racism.
Yes,
It's a little
and it's
different.
on the rise.
Racism. Yeah, how about just crime in general?
Right.
Okay.
Something that's really broke out bad, I'd say one of the last 10 years is motherlessness.
Yes,
Single
orphanages,
So broken families. We're gonna keep them as big categories.
orphanage.
When you say fatherless, we break a whole generation without mothers, so it's,
Yeah, it's still broken families though, just the family has been destroyed.
Yeah.
Any other, yes,
Either or.
Children and adult abuse.
abuse. I'm gonna keep that under violence. Yep, yep.
Lack of spirituality, because there's, or do we have it?
You can't see that, so fruit is something you see. We'll get to more of that in a moment. That's an atmosphere thing, we'll get to that. Any other, and we have, you guys are really good. You know the pain of your city. Sometimes I go into a city, they're like, I don't know. You know, I see things on the news. We have to get in touch with the pain of our city if we're going to see God change our city.
Yeah.
So that's important.
True.
there you go.
Yeah, we'll get to that next, or in a moment. Okay, so this is some of the fruit. Fruit is what grows up. It's what you see. But the truth is, fruit only grows out of a root system.
That's
The
right.
reason that the enemy has control of Wyandotte County is because there's a root system of unrighteousness. So it's been here for, well, actually I did the history of our city when I first moved here. It's been about a year. And the root system of Wyandotte County is a couple hundred years old. And when people settled here, they sowed into the land both righteous things and unrighteous things. Over time, the unrighteous roots have flourished. So you have a very developed root system in the land of Wyandotte County. The issue is not the fruit that you see visibly. The issue are the roots that you don't see. Here's what the church is doing. So, okay, so here's our picture. We have land with an unrighteous root system. And we're let's get back to some of the roots. Well, no, let's not do that yet. So it's just a root system of sin, okay? So the root system of sin, remember all those scriptures we just read about iniquity has separated us from God, the sin, this is what creates the devastation, this is why the land is forsaken, this is why it's desolate, this is why everything is broken and destroyed. It's the sin that has caused the unrighteous fruit to grow up in the city. Does that make sense? It's the sin that has given the enemy the opportunity to fill in the vacuum.
Amen.
Because the church is supposed to have created a righteous root system. We abdicated. We're still here in church. Praise God, we're all going to church. But it has almost no bearing at all on the city around us. So what's happening is the church decides, praise God, the church notices that there's things going on in the city that we should do something about, okay? So that Church A, let's say this is Church A, let's say Church A decides, you know what, we have to do something about the broken families, the motherlessness or the fatherlessness. They get a burden for it. So they decide they're going to go over and they're going to start ministering to the broken families. Let's say Church B decides we have to do something about justice. So they get really involved in justice. And this church decides that we're going straight to City Hall. We're going to do something about the corruption in our city. Or we're going to go to the school system or something. So we have 400 churches. Probably most of them are involved at some level of ministry in the city. But it's completely chaotic.
Yes.
It's not unified. It's not organized.
Yes.
And what's happening is everybody, you might have 30 or 300 churches wanting to do something about families. But it's just kind of spread all over the place.
Yeah.
The deeper issue, the bigger problem is we're dealing with the fruit and not to the roots.
Right.
So if you have a weed growing in your yard, like I do, I have dandelions in my yard. And I was, it's a war trying to get rid of my dandelions. And I learned a couple of years ago, do you know a dandelion has an 18-inch root? So what happens when you pull the head off a dandelion? You get rid of the flower. I think they multiply. I think they get angry. Mine get bigger and they spread. If you pull the fruit up and you don't do anything about the root system, you have not solved anything.
Right.
If you have a root, it will continue to produce bad fruit. That's why I'm not saying we don't get involved in all kinds of social things in our city. We need to do that. But we can't confuse that with dealing with a spiritual root system that will solve the issue. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We do need to do this together, but it's not the first thing we need to do together, and it's not the most important thing that we do together. Because right now back to the 15,000 with the 2 loaves and 2 fish. We are barely scratching the surface. And if you have a good taproot, it can produce fruit so much faster than you can pluck it all up. So that's what's happening. The enemy is able to produce so much unrighteousness because he has control of the root system in the city. This is the argument for why this has to be a supernatural process.
Right.
So we have a church, they're disunified, and they have not done anything with the root system, but they're trying to do the best that they can to improve the condition of the city. But it's not very effective. The real reason the church is not being effective, well, I'm going to make them sad now. They're not happy. Okay, the real reason the church is not being effective and what we're doing is because the root system of sin that's running through the city, it's running right through the church. Who can ascend the hill of the Lord? Who can stand before the throne room with a cry of justice? So what we're doing is and the other thing is because the root system is running through the church,
Man.
Isaiah 59, we've been separated from the presence of the Lord. Right? His arm isn't short that it can't save. He's not deaf that he can't hear our cry. We're crying out, we're praying, but nothing's happening. Why? Because we've been defiled and corrupted by the root system in the city, just like the city has been corrupted. So we go up into the throne room of heaven to plead our case for justice, righteousness, wholeness, healing in our city, and the intercession is either not heard or the case is thrown out because we have blood on our own hands. 250,000 evangelical women will have an abortion this year. Corruption is in the church is corrupt, political, siding with the enemy. The church, the families in the church are broken. The divorce rate is actually a little higher in the church than it is in the world. Okay, so this root system and the fruit, you see that we're implicated.
Yeah.
We are part of the problem. And we can't go before the throne and ask the Lord to bring heaven down because we don't have a voice in heaven and we don't have a voice on the earth because we become part of the mess. When the people of God, or just like Adam and Eve, when we get involved in the mess, the enemy is able to create an atmosphere over the city. So now let's look at the atmosphere. When you have all of this going on, and the heavens are closed, and this is exactly what we talked about last night, the heavens are now closed because we're in trouble. Right, so the Lord has closed the heavens, the locusts are devouring, and sickness is stalking the people. That's a condition, we're in trouble. When the enemy has that much access to the land and the people, and the church is now really in his back pocket, right, she's no threat at all, because she's been corrupted. he's not even concerned about the Lord getting involved because the church is totally impotent at this point, right? So there's no threat to the enemy. He can do whatever he wants. You know what I mean? He's controlling the game. When he has that kind of influence, what happens is the demonic, and just to make it very clear, because this is supernatural, this is demonic activity. Okay, this is the fruit of the kingdom of darkness. If you're going to be a fruit inspector, you have to decide what kind of fruit do you see in your city and which kingdom is it from. Here's how the Fijians start their transformation process. They get together and they do an honest assessment of where they are. And they realize if there's this kind of fruit going on in the village, then God is not living among us. That's conclusion number one. I think that's brilliant. We look at the condition of our city. We go to church on Sunday. We insist he's with us, no matter what it looks like.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
And we measure the activity of the church by the activity of the church. And that's not fair at all. We should measure the effectiveness of the church by the condition of the city.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? We talked about that last night. We don't measure here's what we do in our paneled houses. We measure our effectiveness by ourselves or by one another. Hey, 3 people got saved this week, more than last year, we're doing great. Or we're doing better than the guy down the street, our ministry is bigger, or whatever. Or we look at the bigger church and we're depressed by it. We're measuring ourselves by ourselves in our fruitfulness and our activity. We should be measuring the effectiveness of the church by the condition of the city where we live.
Right. True.
This Bible actually says that the Lord will call heaven and earth to witness against us. Because we were created to manage and steward the earth for the glory of God. That's our role. We're not going into all that today, but that's what he originally intended. You're supposed to be stewarding. You're supposed to be ruling and reigning on the earth. And we're hostages now in the middle of a war zone, shouting hallelujah, Lord send your glory on Sunday mornings, and it's just we're just pretending. This is an indictment against the condition of the church. When it gets like this, what happens is this demonic activity takes over, and you can feel it as soon as you cross the line of that county line. You can feel it. What happens is demons start filling the atmosphere.
Yes, sir.
This is what you feel and what you sense, not what you see. So now tell me what you feel when you come into Wyandotte County. Hopelessness. Right? What else?
Depression.
Depression.
Yes, fear.
Depression. Yeah, fear.
Apathy.
Anger. Fear.
Fatigue.
A tired, apathy.
Heaviness.
Yes, sir.
Fatigue. What else? They're just a general oppression. It's a heaviness.
Uncleanliness.
Oh yeah. Okay.
My God.
Right.
How does it feel? Now, just to make it clear, what you're feeling. This is so important. What you're feeling in your atmosphere is not an emotion. It's a demonic presence that has been allowed to hang out in your atmosphere.
Yes, sir.
Americans just don't think about that. We think it's just something we don't know what it is. We just know we feel something. But this is not an emotion coming from inside of your heart. This is something you're discerning around you because the enemy is living among you. And he's now taking control. Paul calls him the prince of the power of the air.
Yeah.
Right? He's ruling in the spiritual realm over your city. So anybody that's coming in comes right underneath this atmosphere, this canopy. And then you drive into the neighborhoods and you see the fruit, or you hear the fruit, or you drive by the churches, or one on every couple of blocks. They're barricaded or they're locked up, and you see the devastation. I'll never forget when I was ministering in South Central, there was a couple block, every church I mean, every block there was a couple churches barricaded with big black bars on the windows. You know, and in the middle of all the devastation, and that's when the Lord started talking to me about being hostages in a war zone. And the picture of that is so not what God has in mind. So this is what we feel, this is what we see, this is the root system, this is the cause. When I talked about 2 Chronicles last night, remember I said the Lord did not say, because this is our prescription, so the prescription for the mess is 2 Chronicles 7:14. But the Lord did not say to go out and just command that the heavens are open. Doesn't that make sense now? You can't just go out and just bind up a spirit of hatred. Right? Why? Well, because we're part of the problem, because there's hatred in the church. The other problem is there's a root system that's flourishing and producing all the so why go out and just try to declare it's open? It doesn't make any sense. He also didn't say just to bind it up, just go bind up a spirit of, and we're trying to bind up a spirit of division. Well, we start with our own heart, then we start with the church. You see how it makes so much more sense when you see when you really diagnose the condition we're in, then it helps us understand the methodology. And it helps us understand why the things we're doing just aren't working. Doesn't it make more sense?
Yes. Yes.
Now, because we don't know what to do what we think we know to do, which is fine. But I think the Lord the enemy does not want us to understand the real process, because then we get free and we get out. Okay, so let's talk about heaven. We'll make our hearts happy for a minute so we don't get too depressed. So let's go to heaven for a minute. Now tell me what exists in heaven. We talked about the fruit on the earth. What is contained in heaven? Peace?
Love.
Love, joy, righteousness,
Holiness.
holiness, love, what?
The fruit of the Spirit.
Fruit of the Spirit,
Yes.
righteousness, peace, and joy, riches.
My house, my mansion.
Yes.
Go there.
Our home. Authority. I've got healing up here. Wholeness.
Order.
Okay, order. Security.
Yes.
Power and deliverance. You know, actually, to get this list, you just have to figure out the opposite of this
Right.
list.
Yes.
Right?
Amen.
Isn't that what the enemy does? He is the counterfeit of everything good. When God created the heavens and the earth, He intended that everything here would be made known on the earth. That the heavens would declare the glory of the Lord, that the earth would be a witness of the beauty of God, of the power of God. And that's what we're supposed to be stewarding. Everything your community needs here already exists someplace else. You don't need to create it, you don't need to find it. It
Amen.
already exists
Yes.
in the heavenly places.
Yes.
Okay? It's here. Our job is to get what's here to get here. And that happens when we recovenant with the Lord. These are the promises in Isaiah 58, Isaiah 60, Isaiah 61, Isaiah 62, Jeremiah 33. It's when we return to covenant with the Lord starts transforming the mess into His glory. And the process is 2 Chronicles 7:14. So this is what it looks like. The church that was once divided, and I'm not suggesting the church all become one or anything weird like that, but what I am saying is this church, the corporate identity of the church needs to become identified, kind of like last night, that we're a family. That we realize that our corporate identity is more important than our individual paneled houses.
That's right.
So the first thing we do is we start unifying, we start praying together, we start worshiping together, we start becoming a family together. Then the very first step in transformation is we consecrate ourselves together before the Lord. We're going to be happy again. Because what happens is when the church recognizes her corporate identity, she can start dealing with the root system she starts doing 2 Chronicles 7:14, not praying about it, but living it as a lifestyle. We talked about that last
Yes.
week. When she starts repenting, the root system of sin that was running through the church gets uprooted. Right? So all of a sudden, she's no longer part of the problem. She becomes a manifestation of God's presence and glory. She's now something to be contended with. Okay? So now we have the church, and what happens is the church now gets restored vertically.
Yeah.
Dealing with the issues in the city is not our highest priority.
Right.
Getting right with God is the highest priority.
Yeah.
So consecration, the 2 Chronicles 7:14 process, gets the people of God right with God. And what that does is it starts opening the heavens over the church.
Yes.
Then the Lord, what does he say? If my people will, right? If my people will, if you will, then I will.
Yeah. Right.
So as we do this, the Lord responds, and what does he say? I'm going to hear you, I'm going to forgive you, and I'm going to heal your land.
Right.
So then we have covenant being restored between God and his people, which restores spiritual authority to the church. Now we're no longer part of the problem. We're actually sitting with Jesus in heavenly places.
Yes.
We're ruling and reigning as a corporate people. This is what happened in North Omaha, and Tyler was going to tell you about that. They became a spiritual eldership for the city of North Omaha. And they had an audience now with heaven, and the Lord starts speaking and directing. And so then the Lord comes down and he starts filling the church again with his presence. Spiritual authority is restored, joy is restored, sin is uprooted, purity, all kinds of things. Healing happens in the church, in the families, in the hearts. This is the transformation process. This is what we have control over. But the good news is once we're filled with authority, we can actually go now, not to the fruit, but we now go and we start praying and repenting about the root system. Because now we have clean hands and a pure heart. Now we can meet together with the Lord together, and we can ask him to forgive us for the sin of the city. In the North Omaha process, we literally went out into North Omaha and repented for all kinds of things corporately. It's it's on our website. I'm going to tell you where that is so you can read the whole story. But once we did this in the families in North Omaha, then we took the family and we went out into the city, to the courthouse and dealt with racial injustice, into their homes and the families, into the park, to deal with bloodshed. So once the church is restored to the Lord and in spiritual authority, then the church can go out and deal with the root system of iniquity, and then the root system starts getting uprooted. Because the church now has authority to uproot it. Because she's got clean hands and a pure heart. Now, what happens to fruit when the root system disappears?
It does.
It dies. So what you see, this doesn't work perfectly on a whiteboard. It does not mean that all of this disappears. What it does mean, it doesn't mean everything becomes perfect. But what it does mean is you now have influence. Your crime rate should go down. Divorce rates will go down. Poverty will go down. Hope, everything should start changing. You should be able to measure. Remember we talked last night, it's measurable. Once you start seeing transformation, this is where you see it. The fruit will be measurably different than it was. How much gets different, we don't really know. It depends on how many people are involved. In some of the transformation villages, it's probably, they get about 90% of the kingdom coming to the earth. It's a pretty high percentage, a lot of change. In a city this size, we're going to see it at a neighborhood level. It's going to be a smaller percentage, but the point is we're going to start seeing fruit. And once it starts growing, it starts taking over. Because then what happens, as the fruit is uprooted, what happens to your atmosphere? These guys have no legal right to hang out anymore.
Right.
So, the demons, they're like flies in a picnic. They can only hang out if there's something to feed on. And demons feed on sin.
Yeah.
If there's no sin, there's nothing for them to feed on. They've got to go.
Yeah.
So what starts happening then is the atmosphere changes, and guess what it's filled with now? The atmosphere of heaven.
Yeah.
So now when you come into Wyandotte County, hopefully in a couple of years we'll say this, we're going to drive across that same bridge and we're going to feel the peace of the Lord. We're going to feel the joy of the Lord. We're going to feel security, unity. We're going to start feeling that. When you go into a transformed village, that's what happens. You come underneath another canopy, another atmosphere filled with the presence of the Lord, and you feel all of these. And I'll tell you a story just to demonstrate that. As that happens, of course, the fruit, I'm not going to draw this, but you start seeing good fruit in the city. People have jobs, economy grows. Right? There's no more corruption. People have the best in mind for the people that live in the city. Families are restored because you have a different root system. It's a root system of righteousness that produces a crop of righteousness and visible fruit. So the transformation process will change the root system. Changes the root system in the church. The church recovenants with Jesus. The Lord responds, hears them, forgives them, heals the land. The fruit changes, and the atmosphere changes. This is the transformation process. Let me just give you an example of what it feels like in a village in Fiji. Tyrone's laughing. So I'll tell you one village. Well, let me tell you about Nuku. That's on one of the transformation videos. The first village that was transformed in Fiji was called Nuku, N-U-K-U. And it's the chief there, a friend of ours, Chief Vuniani, was the chief over Nuku and that whole area. And he had been to Guatemala and he saw what happened in Almalanga. And he went home and said, basically, Lord, if you can do that there, you can do that in my village. And he started gathering the leaders, the elders, and they started praying to the Lord and asking questions, doing the assessment. Lord, why are we living in so much trouble? And they started crying out to the Lord, and they realized that God, their conclusion was, if we're living in this much mess, then God isn't living with us. And then they decided if he's not living with us, we must have offended him. Which is conclusion number 2, which is really important. So conclusion number 1 is if we're in this much of a mess, then God is not living with us. We don't want to pretend he is if the fruit is of the wrong kingdom. Conclusion number 2 is if he's not living with us, we're not going to project the blame on other people. If he's not here, there's a good reason, and we've offended his presence. And then conclusion number 3 is we've got to do whatever it takes to get him back to our village. So they started the transformation, they just started praying together. They weren't even really looking, this is true about most transformation stories, they weren't motivated by transformation. They just wanted to get right with God.
Yes.
So they started praying, and they started, because as they started praying, 2 Chronicles 7:14, the Lord started telling them what was wrong. The Lord started telling them how he felt about them, how he felt about their leadership, what was wrong in the village, and then they started repenting for everything he showed them. And they did this for weeks. In the middle of Nuku is a stream. It's not very big, probably half the size of this room. And it had been polluted. One of the things that was trouble in their village is Nuku is out in the bush. And there was no water supply except for the river that ran through the village. And it had been polluted for, 42 years at that time. So, yeah, for 42 years. And it was a rusty color, like the color of Jerry's shirt. It was full of arsenic and poison, and people were dying. They were having miscarriages, getting brain tumors. And the government said, you're not allowed to drink the water. You can't even wash your dishes in the water. So they had to haul water for 42 years from 6 hours away. That's a hardship. So, but they weren't thinking about their river. They were just wanting to get right with God. And so they went through the 2 Chronicles 7:14 process, and they repented for several weeks. And then they repented as leaders. Then they took that process into their homes. And they reconciled their families back to the Lord. And then they reconciled tribe to tribe, church to church, tribe to tribe. And they just basically did everything they knew to do to get right with the Lord. And when they had done everything in their heart to do, which is exactly what 2 Chronicles 7:12 or 13 says, Solomon did what was in his heart to do and he went to bed. They had a corporate gathering out on the lawn at their common house. Everybody gathered out on the lawn and they invited they anointed everything with oil, which is fun. The Fijians love oil. They love to anoint with oil. And they anointed everything in the village. They anointed the water. They anointed the crops because the crops had died. The fruit trees weren't bearing fruit. The village was full of, all kinds of sin. So the people anointed everything in the village, and then they just invited Jesus to come. And what they said to him was this: "We've done what you've asked us to do. Now we ask you to come and do what you promised to do."
Right.
The next morning, the women were up in the common house, and they looked down, and the river had run clear.
My God.
I meant to bring you some. I have this water in my prayer room in my house. The river ran completely clear, and God healed it. People were getting in it; they were getting healed. It was amazing, and so He healed the crops, He healed the land, He healed the families, He healed everything, but He healed the river. So the fish came back. So the scientists came out, and sure enough, the water was completely pure, completely healed. And here's what's funny: a couple of years later, the chief was in Kansas City. He was sitting in my living room, and he made some comment that the scientists kept coming back out to test the river in Fiji. And I said, "Booty, why don't they just believe that God did this?" He said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "I think it's because it's still polluted upstream and downstream." So get this. So when the river comes toward the boundary of Nuku with the covenanted people,
Hallelujah.
it's pure.
Amen.
When it leaves the people in covenant with God, it returns to its defiled condition. It's only pure when it runs through the people that are in covenant with the Lord. It's amazing. So I'll tell you one more story. Another village in Talera on the other side. Again, way out on the coast, black sand beach, a beautiful, beautiful place. And this is kind of a wilder story, but it's okay. I think you're ready for it. But some of these stories are wild. And if I hadn't been there and heard the eyewitness accounts and seen the pictures and stuff, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But this is a kind of a crazy one. But so we went to Talera, and this was a village where the teenagers were in rebellion, the crops had died, the coral reefs had died, and there was no economy, and everybody was fighting with one another, a lot of disunity. It wasn't a big place, probably 300 people probably lived in the village. Beautiful place, but just oppressed by the enemy. And this village had been given, somebody from the tourism department, somebody had gifted the village 2 idols. And there are Christians in the village, they didn't even think about it because of their condition. So they set the idols up on 2 posts because it looked cool, and they were trying to be a tourism business because they have these original huts and stuff, and you can see all this on my website. So they thought it looked kind of cool to have these 2 idol heads, and so they put them on these posts at the entrance of the village. But when they put the idols there, something changed in the village. Darkness just came in a very, very dramatic way. They could hear the idols talking at night. Fear gripped the people, and they started blaming it on each other, so witchcraft got really heavy in the village. I think some people, they were getting cursed and dying. It got really serious because they basically just invited the enemy to come into the village. Literally gave them the entrance point of the village. So life went on, but things got very fearful. Everything was becoming barren and desolate. And then one day a young boy, 16-year-old boy, rode a horse through the entrance to the gate of the village. And nobody knows if it was intentional or not, but he knocked over one of these idols and broke its neck.
My God.
But somebody from the village just got the idol and tied the head back on the idol and put it back on its post. But the young boy started getting really depressed after that happened. He wouldn't leave his house. He just got really, really more depressed. And I think on day 3 or 4, he hung himself from the tree in the center of the village. And suicide in Fiji is unheard of. It's just not something that ever happens. And the whole village just went into shock. Because here was this young boy hanging from the middle of a tree in their village, and something had come over him. And they knew that the enemy was running the life in their city, or in their village. And they knew something had come in, and they were in real trouble. And so they called the Healing the Land team. They called the chief and his team of young people that help villages go through transformation. And they said, we need your help. So the team comes in, and they took the villagers for about 3 weeks through a process of 2 Chronicles 7:14, and they started repenting for their idolatry and their immorality and their rebellion. You know, they just went through all of it. They went into their homes and their huts, and they reconciled their families. They did the whole process. And the next day, they committed the village back to the Lord, just like they always do. And the next morning, and we actually stayed in this village. Were you on that trip? Let me tell you, Rob. We stayed in the village that night, and I remember I was sleeping in the common house. Like, there weren't a lot of places for us to stay, so I was just sleeping on a mat. And I remember when we got to the village, the atmosphere was so full of the presence of God. My spirit just got so connected to it that I couldn't sleep that night. It wasn't like I wasn't physically tired, but it was like my spirit got plugged in to another outlet, you know?
Yeah.
And so I didn't sleep all night, and I woke up because there's a lot of big frogs and crickets, and I'm not used to sleeping in a Fijian village, and I'm like, it's kind of like you're sleeping outside. So at sunrise, I'm awake. And my first thought was, because this is how I am wired if I'm here in the States, it's 6:30 in the morning, I've not slept all night. They don't drink coffee, so there's no hope for me. And that's how I think. You know, I'm tired, I'm going to be grumpy. We're a long way from the capital city, the hotel, where I can get some creature comfort. There's no coffee anywhere in this village. And oh my gosh, this is going to be a long day. So I got up and I decided to walk down to the beach. And I walked out of this community center, and I walked out into the atmosphere, and I was just overwhelmed with the presence of the Lord. It was a beautiful morning, and so I decided to walk down to the beach. And because they fish early in the morning, the women go out fishing. And so I'll tell you my testimony, and then I'll finish the story I'm going to tell you. So I go out, and I realize I'm not tired at all. At all. It was like I've been plugged into some other source of power and strength and life. My body, my physical body, my flesh wasn't tired at all. I didn't need coffee. That was such a revelation for me. Because you know how, let me just say this, we live under so much oppression.
Yes.
And we're trying to fix it and medicate it with so many ways. But when you live in an atmosphere like this, you don't need any of that. I noticed this when I was first in Nuku as well. When I first got under that atmosphere, I could commune with the Lord. And one of the things I say, people think it sounds funny, but it's true. I become a really nice person when I'm in a transformed village. I'm going to tell you why. When I'm in an atmosphere of the presence of God, my spirit man is in control.
Yes.
And the Lord has redeemed me. So the glory of the Lord lives in me. He lives in me, and He comes back out of me. When I'm in this kind of atmosphere, my flesh nature is in charge. And picture the atmosphere before, I'm being harassed by all the demons in the atmosphere. I'm being flooded with thoughts and lies and condemnation and insecurity. And I have a war going on in my mind all the time. When you're living in an atmosphere of the presence of God, there's no more war. You're just free to commune with the Lord, to feel the Lord's presence. I didn't need coffee. I didn't need sleep. Now, that's true. If you hear about people, even in revival history, you don't need to sleep. You don't really need to eat. You're in another realm. It's really true. So I felt the atmosphere. In Natalira, the morning after they committed their village to the Lord, the women were walking, they were going back out to fish early in the morning. They net fish. And they were walking along the beach, or coming this way. It's a beautiful beach. And there were two women, and they looked out over the water, and a column of fire was coming down from heaven. It was spiritual, but they could see it. And they saw the fire come down, and it touched the water, and it ignited the sea. And the water started to burn. You know, it actually says it in Isaiah, even as you send your fire, you cause water to burn. This is all in the Bible. We just haven't been able to read it. We have the wrong glasses on. You know? So this column of fire comes down, and the eyewitness, which I've heard her several times. I just cry. I don't know what to do when I hear stories like that. And she describes it. The last time I was there, she described the fire. She said it was the width of a refrigerator, and it was moving on the inside. Like something was moving. It was just the Shekinah glory of God. But the point is, the Lord restored, He came back with His presence after their process, and He wanted people to know He was there, which He always does in Fiji. He always lets them know when He's back, which is His kindness. So the fire of God falls. It came again, I think 2 or 3 days in a row, and a whole bunch of people saw it, but they knew that God had restored His presence down to the village of Natali Rock. And the cool thing is, you know who the woman was? She was the mother of the boy that committed suicide. Wow. Isn't that sweet of the Lord? He let her see it. He let her know. Then they went to fish that morning. And guess what? Right where the fire fell, they caught 3,600 fish that they hadn't seen in 50 years. Wow. 3,600 fish. They started hollering up for people. They brought sheets. They brought blankets. They were just trying to catch them all and bring them up under the shore. God started restoring the life in the sea. The coral reef was restored. The crops were restored. The people were healed. I mean, He just did an amazing thing. Now, 300 people don't need 3,600 fish. Remember the story of the loaves and fishes. Why did God do that? He's always doing an extravagant thing. He's not going to just meet our needs. So He gave them. So what they started doing, they started drying the fish, and they started feeding other villages. Which raised a big question. Hey, we haven't seen that fish for 50 years. How did you get that fish back? Well, let us tell you our story. We have offended the presence of God. We had to get right with God. We had to repent for our idolatry. And the Lord came, and when He came, He had healing in His wings. Here, have some fish. So what happens in Fiji is the report of the Lord is what stirs a transformation process. When you have fire, you can spread fire. You can offer fire.
My God.
What we try to do is we try to spread fire that we don't have. So the motivation for starting small, here's the motivation. You get reduced, same principle. You add a little wine, the reduction adds more volume. Now you can feed a lot of people with what got reduced. See, then the volume increases. So if we're reduced to a small number until we get it right with God, He starts a fire. That's why we're going to focus on congregations and neighborhoods and families for a while. Because it's worth it. Once you get that, you can offer that sauce to everybody in Wyandotte County. They're going to wonder, how did you get that? How is God doing that? Well, let me tell you how He's doing that. We started here. We didn't start out here with the mess. We started with our own hearts and our own families. So in Fiji, this was the craziest thing I ever saw. They have a waiting list for transformation. There's usually about 30 villages on it, and they just systematically go one village to another. The first couple of villages, nobody knew what was going to happen. So there wasn't a lot of faith for it. They were just trusting the Lord. But when you're village number 295, and God has come, which He has in Fiji, they have a 100% success rate. Why? Because this always works. God is always faithful. So if you're the 295th village, and God has already transformed 294, the obedience level of that village is going to be pretty high, right? This isn't. Nobody wonders anymore if this is going to work. We know it works because God is a God of His Word, and His Word always works. If we're obedient, if we will, then He really will. So the whole nation is filled with faith. Anybody you talk to in Fiji will tell you a story of transformation. I remember I was at a resort for a couple of days after going there so many times. I finally took 2 days because it's a beautiful place. Spent a couple days, and there was a lady on the beach giving massages. And she came over and had lunch with us, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I always say, when they ask me that, they always ask, what are you doing here? And I always say, oh, I've come to your nation to see all the good things that God is doing here. And they always say, oh, yes, let me tell you my testimony. They always have a testimony. So she starts saying, oh, yes, God came to my village. And she just pours out the crabs. The crabs are like this big. He healed everything. And she said, and here's how she described it. She was so happy. She said, oh, yes. She said, and then we went out. We gathered our tribe from all the other islands. We gathered together on a Sunday, and we married Jesus, she said. That's what she said. We had a big ceremony where the whole village married Jesus. She's just talking about covenant.
Yeah.
And she said, and then he healed everything in our village. And she said, well, I have to get, she was 52 years old, and she said, well, I have to get home now. I have a baby at home. I said, really? Oh, yes. She said, our village, this was a big issue in Fiji, a lot of barrenness. Barrenness is not just spiritual. She said, when the Lord came, she said, I had my first baby. He restored me. The fact is, so many barren women are now having babies in Fiji. They name their children, the second name, their middle name, they name them Healing the Land, after the Healing the Land team. That's how common it is. Because they're so grateful to the Lord. This woman was 52 years old, waiting all of her, she was a Hannah. So when he heals barrenness, you guys, we have no idea how far he's willing to go, how far he's able to go. So, I mean, anywhere you go in Fiji, I mean, you just ask. I remember getting a taxi ride with a Hindu guy, because half of Fiji is Indo-Fijian, they're Hindu. And so he was Indian, so I thought, oh my gosh, he's probably Hindu, I'm going to try to lead him to the Lord. He was trying to lead me to the Lord because he Anyway, the other thing I'll mention about Fiji is when the Lord healed their land and transformed their nation, he transformed their government. And Christians got elected in the government.
Amen.
So now the church and the government work together for the benefit of the people. I'll give you one conversation I heard that it just blew my mind. We were sitting in a meeting with leaders, and the guy, I can't remember his name, that led the Department of Tourism. 96% of Fiji's revenue is generated by tourism. So this guy had the purse strings for all the finance coming into the nation. But he was a believer, and he was sitting next to Asanatha, this lady, her responsibility was to take care of the welfare of all the women and children in the nation of Fiji. So the guy with all the money is sitting next to the woman with all the needs, all the felt needs. And you know what their conversation was? How he could use his budget to finance the needs of the women and children in Fiji. Can you imagine if our government worked that way? Where it wasn't corrupt, it wasn't about getting wealthy, it wasn't about using and abusing people. It was really about, wow, let's generate as much revenue as we can, give people as many jobs as we can, and then let's take the revenue and reinvest it in the people of the city so that they can, flourish and grow. That's what righteousness is. That's what government is.
Hallelujah.
So you just see this wonderful. I remember another meeting I was at, a leadership meeting. The same woman, Asanatha, was coming back to speak at our conference, and she was late. And she apologized. I'm so sorry I'm late. She said, but we had a spontaneous worship service in Congress, in Parliament this morning. We worshiped the Lord for 3 hours. Now, what could God do in a nation if the Parliament, can you even, it's hard for us to even believe that. But I'll tell you, their government was just as corrupt as ours. They've had coups all of their history. But now there was a righteous prime minister in place, and so God was allowed to come in. It's just, I could go on and on. Every revival in history God has used to change society, change government, that's how anything good has ever happened, is when God steps into the situation and he brings healing and life. And so transformation is not totally different from revival in history, but God is going further now than we've ever seen him go before, because we're in the end of the days. I don't know what that means, but we're clearly, if we're on a whiteboard from Abraham and covenant to the Lord returning, the New Jerusalem. We're at that end of the whiteboard, right? So God is doing more because the work of redemption is increasing on the earth. Amen. Yes. Oh yeah, well so in the process of consecration, they get rid of all the idols, they burn everything, they repent for everything. I'll tell you one more story. This is also on our website. It's the story of Tavua. On our website, let me just give you that. It's fusionministry.com. Fusion. It's also on your books, where I've got some prayer cards back there you can look at. Fusionministry.com. On the home page, there's a section called What Does It Look Like? And that's where all the stories are. If you click on that, you can find the North Omaha story. You can find the story of Tavua, Fiji, Norway reports and things. But Tavua is an amazing story. But we actually partnered with the Healing the Land team to transform a village. And when we got there that night, no transformation had ever happened in this area. The atmosphere was so full of demonic oppression, we didn't even go outside that night. And I won't share the story because you can read it. We started worshiping the next morning, and within 24 hours, the entire atmosphere had changed, and I personally witnessed that. Until that point, I'd been in the village after transformation happened. I'd never seen it happen. I'd certainly never been a part of it. And why was I telling you about Tavua? The idols. Oh, so we were prayer support. So we were worshiping and praying in our prayer hut while the Fijians were preaching the gospel to the village. So everybody in the village came to these meetings, and they would just simply tell the people, this is why you're in trouble. This is what's offended God. This is, teaching about idolatry or sexual immorality or bloodshed or whatever. And this is what you need to do to get right with God, and then He'll come live with you. I mean, it's basically that simple. So we were there one night, and Save was preaching about idolatry. And this was a village that had snake gods. They were steeped in idolatry. And yes, they were Christian people. We have our own idols, amen? We do.
Yes.
They don't look like something like that, but we do. And so he called them forward to repent for their idolatry. And I will never forget what I saw. I saw an entire village of people standing at an altar, weeping and confessing their sin of idolatry. It was the most powerful thing I'd ever seen. And the next morning we woke up, and it was so intense. We got there that night. I had a spider this big running around my bedroom. What? There were demonized dogs growling and snarling. There were rats in our room. I mean, when we landed in Tavua, the enemy was waiting for us. It was because nobody had ever gone in. It was really, really dark, and it was full of cannibals and full of bloodshed and full of immorality. And so that was the night before. Within 24 hours, the next morning we woke up. The birds were singing, the atmosphere was clear, and we walked out, and the people of the village were out talking and laughing. And I watched the village change in less than 24 hours because they repented. It was powerful. So they had to get rid of their idols, and this was part of. I was in another village where they had a stone idol. I can't remember the name of this village, but they'd set it up for hundreds of years ago, and it was just. There was this big stone idol at the gate of the village, and they all paid homage to it. It would just be part of their culture. Even the Christians, they drive up the road and they just not. They just pay homage to this idol. They've done it for hundreds of years. And when the village got transformed, Namoka, it's called Namoka. When the village got transformed, and I saw this pit. I've got pictures of it somewhere. But they went down and they chopped up. They chopped up the stone idol and they made a barbecue pit out of it. So much for their big, powerful God. He was a barbecue pit. The whole village got saved. So when you uproot this stuff, it loosens the grip of the enemy. It changes the atmosphere. And then the people living in the community can sense the presence. Remember I talked last night about no fear of the Lord, no conviction of sin? Right. When you deal with the atmosphere, that all changes. Now people, they can sense God. God's everywhere in the atmosphere. Now they want to give their hearts to Jesus. That's why entire villages are getting saved. Entire Hindu villages in Fiji are being saved. Like en masse, like the whole village is getting saved. because the atmosphere has changed. So, okay, that's a good deposit about atmosphere.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Does it make sense?
Yes.
So the reason I do this is so we're going to be convinced that we start here and not here,
Yeah.
right? That we go up and not out, that we go in and not out, that we are willing to be reduced until, you see, I mean, there's just a lot of principles. I know it's been a lot really fast, but you're catching it all. I'm just, it's amazing how prepared you are for this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Praise God.
Amen.
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 I'm going to pray. We're going to take a lunch break.